Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This program is the 8th in a series of programs I'm doing on the famous American wisdom writer Ralph Waldo Emerson. In my last program, I focused on Emerson's provocative views on religion. Today I will continue with that theme. Emerson had 2 degrees from Harvard University, including one from its divinity school. Indeed, Emerson was employed as an ordained Protestant minister in his late 20s. It was at this time that he made this entry in his journal about being a minister, and I'm quoting him. "I have sometimes thought that in order to be a good minister, it was necessary to leave the ministry." He went on to say, and I'm quoting him, "The profession is antiquated." Well, several years after writing that in his journal, Emerson did resign from the ministry and embarked on a new career, a career as both a lecturer and essayist. Today, Emerson is regarded by many experts as the greatest essayist the United States has ever produced. Emerson's primary topics, his primary interest in lecturing and in writing essays, was in spiritual and philosophical themes. Emerson was a student of comparative religion. Indeed, he had a passion for studying the world's major religions, including Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Confucianism, and did I leave anything out? I'm not so sure. I think I got them all in there. Emerson believed that all the world's major religions contained important truths, but that all were imperfect. Emerson was a very spiritual man who eventually became a persistent critic of organized religion. Indeed, I think Emerson proves the thesis that one can be a very spiritual person and not participate in organized religion. In my last program, I focused on the most controversial lecture Emerson ever gave on the subject of religion. He gave it at the Harvard Divinity School in 1838, when he was 35 years old. The lecture was so incendiary that as a result of the lecture, some people branded Emerson a heretic, others branded him an atheist. As a result, he was not invited back to Harvard for almost 30 years. Allow me the benefit of those who might have missed my last program, again, on this very famous lecture. Let me just briefly go over some of the main points that Emerson made in, again, his very famous Harvard Divinity School lecture. Remember now that in this lecture, he is addressing future ministers. Indeed, he was addressing the senior class at the Harvard Divinity School. Perhaps the least controversial point Emerson made in this lecture was the following. He claimed, and this was a theme he often repeated, he claimed it is in the selfish interest of human beings to be virtuous. He claimed that life will have a sweeter flavor if we try hard to be decent, kind, just people. Then moving on in his lecture, Emerson told these future ministers that, in his opinion, there is no certainty in religion. There is no certainty in religion. Indeed, he urged these future ministers to confess their doubts to their parishioners. Here are Emerson's own words. "Let their doubts know that you have doubted, and their wonder feel that you have wondered. Emerson believed that very often in life, the most appropriate emotion is one of wonder. Emerson also, in this presentation at the Divinity School, emphasized intuition as the primary way of accessing spiritual and religious truths. Emerson, time and time again, emphasized the importance of intuition in life. Here are his own words. He said this: "Religious truth is an intuition. It cannot be received at second hand. Truly speaking, it is not instruction, but rather provocation that I can receive from another soul." What he announces, I must find true in myself or reject. On the subject of Jesus Christ, Emerson said this, and again I'm quoting him: "Jesus Christ belonged to the true race of prophets. But what a distortion did his doctrine and memory suffer in the following ages." He went on to say, and again I'm quoting him, "Churches are not built on his principles." Continuing on the theme of Jesus Christ, Emerson said this: "In the language that describes Jesus to Europe and America, the friend of man is made the injurer of man." Emerson said that so often Jesus is painted as a demagogue, in the same way as the ancient Orientals and Greeks would describe some of their gods, such as Osiris or Apollo. Emerson believed that in talking about Jesus and in describing Jesus' work, the emphasis should not be on Jesus the Punisher, who sends some people to an eternal hell. But rather, Emerson believed the emphasis when talking about Jesus should be on Jesus the profound psychologist, the Jesus who offers us important insights about life and human nature. And the most important insight Emerson believed that Jesus gives us is the idea that it is in our selfish interest to try to be good human beings, that even if there were no heaven, even if there were no hell, life on earth will be much more satisfying if, again, we try to be just human beings. Emerson was not alone in believing this. So many of the great thinkers have said this, including Plato, Spinoza, and Kant. Indeed, the French essayist Montaigne put it this way: "There is some sort of gratification in doing good, which gives us joy." And now for Emerson's most controversial statement in his address to the Harvard Divinity School senior class. He said this, and I'm quoting him: "Let me admonish you, go it alone, and dare to love God without mediator or veil." And what is Emerson saying here? Emerson is saying that people don't need priests, ministers, imams, Hindu leaders, and other kinds of clergymen to learn about what is truly spiritual and to learn about God. Remember, Emerson attached great importance to intuition and self-reliance to accessing what is truly spiritual and religious. Indeed, Emerson claimed that the reliance on authority measured the decline of religion. I'll say that again. Emerson believed the reliance on authority measured the decline of religion. Emerson's criticism of the ministry and conventional religious thinking met with indignant opposition among the clergy and others. I mentioned earlier on that Emerson was branded as a heretic by some and atheist as others. And what were the main criticisms? What were the main criticisms of Emerson's famous lecture at the Harvard Divinity School? Well, I think a journalist, Andrews Norton, who wrote for a Boston newspaper, sums up the major criticisms. And by the way, in this piece, again, which he wrote for a newspaper, Norton took Emerson to task and indeed used some very vitriolic language to condemn Emerson's lecture. And here's what this journalist wrote. There can be no intuition of the truths of Christianity. We must have Christianity through the Bible and through the church, or not at all. So again, this journalist is attacking Emerson's notion that through intuition, instead of primarily through the Bible and the church, we can access important religious truths. Emerson also, in his Divinity School address, criticized ministers for their formal and uninspired style in the pulpit, at least many ministers. Emerson believed that so many ministers, in a word, were very boring in their sermons, and that their sermons were not very relevant to the lives of their parishioners. And what advice did Emerson give these future ministers about how they could improve their sermons? Well, Emerson said this. He said that ministers and other clergy people should inject their own life into their sermons and what they have learned in their own lives. Indeed, Emerson said that part of the minister's job is the following, and I'm quoting Emerson. Part of the minister's job is, quote, to convert life into truth. And also, Emerson said, and again I'm quoting him, the true preacher deals out to the people his life passed through the fire of thought. What do you think? Emerson later came to embrace ecumenism. In 1869, at the age of 66, in a famous speech he gave to an organization called the Free Religious Association, in embracing ecumenism, he specifically praised the Quakers and the Jews, and went on to say, somewhat sarcastically, and again I'm quoting him, I think we might now relinquish our theological controversies to communities more ignorant and idle than we. Again, I think we might now relinquish our theological controversies to communities more ignorant and idle than we. Emerson in the past had made this comment. He said this, we are now so far from the road to religious truth that religious teachers of the various religions dispute each other and often hate each other. You recall, Emerson's emphasis was always on ethics and not church dogma, which he believed was of questionable truth. In other words, to Emerson, the important question was not what can I know, but rather how shall I live? Indeed, Emerson questioned the existence of the Christian God of tradition. He said this, and again I'm quoting him. when we have broken our God of tradition and ceased from our God of rhetoric, then may God fire our hearts with his presence. Philosopher Bertrand Russell, in the 20th century, wrote of the Christian God of tradition. And he pointed out that this so-called Christian God of tradition sentenced some people to an eternal hell. The idea was that in hell, one's punishment never ends. One never gets out of hell. Well, Russell took this, again, traditional Christian God to task. And he said this. Russell said that no truly humane person would want any other human being to suffer forever. And therefore, Russell pointed out that the Christian God of tradition, since he supposedly sentenced some people to an eternal hell, had a character defect. The French intellectual, the 18th century French intellectual, Voltaire, sounded a similar note. Voltaire claimed that the church has insulted God by a description of his appetite for punishment. Is that possible? That the Christian churches, by emphasizing God's penchant for punishing sinners and the kinds of punishment God doles out to people, that the Christian churches have insulted God? Do you agree with Voltaire on this count? Emerson had some harsh words for some of the clergy of his day. He and another minister of his day, Theodore Parker, who also became quite famous, both claimed, without naming names, that some ministers did not believe some of what they preached. Parker put it this way, and I'm quoting this minister: "Alas for that man who consents to think one thing in his closet and preach another in his pulpit. God shall judge him in his mercy, and not man in his wrath. But over his study and over his pulpit might be writ the word emptiness, and on his canonical robes and on his forehead might be writ the word deceit." Emerson, in a similar vein, in talking about some clergy people whom he believed actually preached some things they didn't believe, said this, and I'm quoting Emerson: "The clergy has bronchitis, which does not seem a certificate of spiritual health." Emerson went on to suggest that it came, and I'm quoting him, "it came of the falsetto of their voicing." Again, what Emerson is saying here is that it was a result of the insincerity of some clergymen in some of their preaching. Emerson, the former minister, remember he was a former minister, believed that people often confuse the truth of God with the word of man. Important question for my viewers. And this is a question that Emerson raised. When priests, ministers, imams, rabbis preach, how much of what they say represents God's thinking, God's mind, and how much of it their own views, their own interpretations of God's mind? Perhaps the most important question is this: can anyone know with certainty the mind of God? As I've mentioned before, Emerson's emphasis was on ethics and not dogma. Indeed, Emerson believed there are few things in life we can know with certainty, and especially when it comes to religion and God. There are few things we can know with certainty. Emerson believed, by the way, the main purpose in life is to become a good human being, that nothing is more important. But now back to the question, back to a very important question. Can anyone know with certainty the mind of God? Assuming, of course, that God exists. Do you believe that priests know with certainty the mind of God? Do you believe that the Pope knows with certainty the mind of God? Do you believe that Protestant ministers and Protestant bishops know with certainty the mind of God? How about Jewish rabbis, Muslim imams, Hindu religious leaders? And Pat Robertson, the famous Protestant contemporary minister, the late Jerry Falwell, and one of the most popular ministers today in America, Rick Warren, who recently interviewed both John McCain and Barack Obama. Do you believe that Rick Warren knows with certainty the mind of God? Is it not true that there are religious leaders of virtually all the major religions who seemingly speak with certainty? Despite their apparent certainty, there are serious disagreements among them about God and about sin. For example, there are serious disagreements between the Catholic Church and certain Protestant denominations. And what's interesting is all Christians read what is essentially the same Bible. Yet let me give you an example of how the Catholic Church differs from certain Protestant churches in its teachings. The Catholic Church teaches that the following actions, behaviors, are immoral. The Catholic Church teaches that divorce is immoral, using condoms is immoral, and homosexual sex is immoral. Well, the fact of the matter is, some Protestant churches do not teach that any of these behaviors are immoral. Indeed, the Episcopal Church, within the last couple of years, appointed a gay man who lives with another man to the position of bishop. Gene Robinson is his name. You've probably read about him. Gene Robinson is presently an Episcopalian bishop in New Hampshire. And again, an active homosexual who lives with another man. The Catholic Church, of course, would claim that he's living in sin, and I know it's fair to say the church would never consider appointing a homosexual to the position of bishop. But again, the point I'm making is it's not unusual that Catholic clergy people and Protestant clergy people will talk with apparent certainty about the Bible and God and sin, and yet there are serious disagreements among them. Doesn't this indicate that despite their apparent certainty in telling us what God considers sinful behavior, that some of them are mistaken? They can't all be right if they disagree. More questions for my viewers. Can one claim to know the mind of God with certainty and still be a humble person? Is claiming to know the mind of God with certainty evidence of arrogance or even mental instability? What do you think? By the way, what has usually determined the religion of religious leaders? For example, what has determined the religion of the Pope, of Pat Robertson, of Rick Warren, of Protestant Muslim leaders, of Protestant Hindu leaders, of prominent Jewish leaders. Well, many scholars claim that geography usually is the decisive element in determining someone's religion. What am I talking about? Allow me to explain. If the Pope had been born and raised in Saudi Arabia by Muslim parents, what are the chances he would be the Pope today? And what if some prominent Muslim leaders had been raised in Italy by devout Catholic parents? What are the chances these Muslim leaders today would be Muslims? And if some prominent Jewish leaders had been born and raised in Japan by Buddhist parents, what are the chances that today they would be Jewish rabbis? In other words, again, the question, what has determined the religion of most people in the world? And as I suggested to you, so many of the scholars have said geography is usually the decisive element. Another question for my viewers. Some Christian leaders teach that only Christians can go to heaven. Only Christians can go to heaven. That Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists can't get in. Can't get in. Are these Christian leaders insulting God? Aren't they saying that God has a great capacity for cruelty in denying the opportunity for most people in the world, because most people are not Christians, of getting into heaven? What do you think? Finally, let me close with a quotation from from Voltaire, famous 18th century French intellectual. Here is a quote on the subject of certainty and Voltaire's view of certainty. It is only charlatans who are certain. Doubt is not a very agreeable state, but certainty is a ridiculous one. What do you think? And now to close in my usual way with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau in Walden penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."